This event. Very warm welcome to everybody to this event, which is in the Food for Thought panel talk series organised by the Annual Food Agenda, funded by the EU and the Cambridge Global Food Security, which is an interdisciplinary research centre at the University of Cambridge. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we get started. Please note that this session is being recorded. Please also note that your microphones and videos have been disabled, as has the function for chat and raise hand. But importantly, the function that has not been disabled, hopefully, is the Q&A. And we're really keen that everybody who's participating, and there are a fair few of you, which is fantastic, post questions in the Q&A from the moment we get going. I want us to turn over at least half of this session to engaging those of you who are attending this event to be able to increase the discussion from our lively and expert panel. I'm Teresa and I'm chairing the panel this evening, and I'm director of the Behaviour and Health Research Unit here at the University of Cambridge. I'm a psychologist and behavioural scientist, and my research focuses very much on environments that shape our behaviour, often much more strongly than our intentions to change our behaviour. And my research also focuses on the gap between the evidence on changing our behaviour, and today we're going to be talking about diets. So the gap between the evidence on how we might change our diets, how we eat, how much we eat, and the policies that we have at the moment to enable healthier diets. We've got three excellent panelists. We've got Dr. Giles Yeo, also from the University of Cambridge at the Wellcome MRC Institute of Metabolic Science. We've got Dolly also from the University of Cambridge, the MRC Epidemiology Unit. And finally, we have Professor Corinna from City University of London. Now, the way we're going to run this is each of the three panelists are going to make some introductory comments for about 5 minutes each. I'll then pose a few questions, and then we'll hand over to you, the audience, for you to ask your questions, or rather, you will have posted your questions in the Q&A. You can upvote questions that you see, and then I will take some of those questions and put them to the panelists. So the question that we're focusing on today is what makes it so hard to eat healthily? And you're going to hear many figures during these presentations. And I just wanted to get in first with three that captured my attention regarding the problem. So the first is globally, the proportion of children who are overweight or obese has increased more than fourfold over the last 40 years. So this is globally, from around 4% to 18%. Second set of figures to share is closer to home in the UK. Around 35% of children aged 11 are overweight or obese. But importantly, that's socially patterned. So the range goes from around 24% who live in the most affluent areas to 42% of children who are overweight or obese in the least affluent areas. And the third set of figures to share, I'm focusing on being overweight or obese, and that has many adverse clinical outcomes as well as psychological and social, but just focusing on the clinical, the ones that are well rehearsed, increasing the likelihood of developing a range of cancers, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes. But as we've seen in COVID, in March, the World Obesity Federation published a set of figures and showed that the death rate from COVID-19 was around 10 times higher in the countries that had populations where more than 50% were overweight or obese. That's in adults. So the UK sadly qualifies for that, where we have around 63% of adults who are overweight or obese, as does the US, as does Italy and Belgium, to name just a few. So there are many reasons to understand why we eat unhealthily, with these resulting adverse consequences on both the extent, the length of our lives and the quality of our lives. And so what I hope we're going to hear today is a more nuanced understanding for all of us on why it's difficult to eat unhealthily, and hopefully through that we can begin to unpack some of the ways in which we can make it easier to eat more healthily. So with those introductory comments, I'm delighted to ask Giles Yeo to make some introductory comments. So first of all, Giles is, as I've already said, at the University of Cambridge, and he researches the influence of genes on feeding behaviour and body weight. He's a graduate tutor and fellow of Wolfson College here in Cambridge, and honorary president of the British Dietetic Association. He is also a science broadcaster and author, with his book, Why Calories Don't Count, published only last week. Giles told me for a nanosecond it was number 4 in the best-selling charts. And finally, Giles was awarded an MBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours in 2020 for services to research, communication and engagement. Giles, it's a great pleasure to have you here this evening.
Thank you so much, Teresa. Thank you to the organizers for this and for us to be able to tackle this actually quite nuanced answer. People think it's easy, and people, not necessarily you, but I think the prevailing view of society, and more importantly, the people who make the decisions, the policymakers, is that healthy eating, body weight, which are clearly going to be, and health in many ways are interwoven together, is a choice. Okay, and I guess my position, which I'm taking here, and I'm a geneticist, is that it's actually in large part not a choice. And we now know that there is a huge genetic element into BMI, into our body weight. Okay, a huge genetic component. And so I study the genetics of body weight, small, medium, large, in this food environment. And now we know that by definition, the understanding of the genetics of obesity and body weight is by its very definition studying the genetics of how our brain influences food intake and feeding behavior in particular. And so we now know that for some people, because of their genetic hand of cards, that they just find it more difficult to say no than others. They're more driven towards food for a myriad of different reasons. No one individual pathway, but for a myriad of different reasons. And so we know the heritability of body weight to be between 40 and 70%. And we know of over 1,000 genes that play a role, most of which exist and function within the brain. And as I said, most of which influence our feeding behavior. Okay, but that is the biological variation, and that is what I study. But as Teresa mentioned in her introductory statements, the prevalence of obesity is socially patterned. Okay, and that's because in addition to it not being a choice from a biological perspective, it's not a choice in very many ways in a socioeconomic perspective. So I mentioned that the heritability of body weight is between 40 and 70%. So why is there a range? Why is it not 50%? Why haven't I taken the average? So I've got a colleague of mine, Professor Claire Llewellyn, down at UCL in London. I'm quoting her work here. And she runs a twin study called the Gemini study. And, people can understand, trying to understand the genetics of given traits in twins. But uniquely, her twin study has socioeconomic markers. And what she has shown, okay, very, very interestingly, to a geneticist point of view, is that if you go to the households of us here in this meeting tonight, painfully middle-class people, all right, that the heritability of body weight is actually around, this is amongst twins, around 40%. Whereas if you go to the households at the lowest, in the most obesogenic environments, at the lowest socioeconomic class, suddenly that heritability jumps up to 70%. There is no genetic difference between people who are poor and rich. It's an accident of birth. Okay, so here we have a large chunk of the heritability of body weight that is actually down to your socioeconomic positioning. So now mix into that, and I'll shut up, mix into that the current food environment that we're living in, okay, that is well rehearsed. Why is it so difficult for us to eat healthily? Because for a large number of us, either for biological or for socioeconomic reasons, okay, we find it more difficult to say no. We're fighting biology, we're fighting our luck in life, we're fighting our status in life. So if we're going to try and get people to actually be healthier, well, let me tell you something. We need to make the healthy choice, the easier choice, the more convenient choice, and the cheaper choice, the cheapest choice. That way we can actually tackle diet-related illnesses with some level of equity. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Giles. Could I just ask you to unpack a tiny little bit for those who are less conversant with ideas of heritability, that really interesting interaction that you described. So you described that there was no difference in the heritability of obesity across social groups, but there's something about living in a household that is less affluent that means the heritability shows through more. Could you just say a little bit about why that might be? Because I think there would be some people who are thinking, what's happening here?
So if you, because of your whatever accident of genetics, happen to be more genetically susceptible to be driven towards food, either you are more hungry, you find food more rewarding, you happen to comfort eat, any number of different reasons, okay? Now, if suddenly you are susceptible to eating a slice of pizza whenever you want or whatever it is better if you're susceptible to not actually have to make the decision. And I think that's the first thing. And so middle-class people like us, yes, I can choose to have, Uber Eats tonight and get a Pizza Hut or whatever. Okay. Or I could be painfully middle class and go have, and I actually have hummus in my fridge. It's terrible, but I do. Okay. And I could have hummus. Whereas if you're at a different socioeconomic, and socioeconomic is very easy to think. People think that socioeconomic is just cash, which in part it is, but it's also having time. So you need to work 2 jobs, and it's also having the knowledge. And so I think what happens is if you're then hungry in a position in which you are lacking time and cash and probably some knowledge of what to do with a lentil, for example, okay, then I think you find yourself in more of a position to spend your pennies, okay, on food that is going to be hyper palatable and cheap, more importantly. And I think that's the reason why. So I think if you're susceptible, the last thing you're going to want to do is to be forced to make a decision, between 2 choices like that.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much. So that's kicked us off on several fronts, the biology as well as the social causes or the social context. So that's great. I'm now going to turn to Dolly Thers, and Dolly is a final year PhD student at the MRC Epidemiology unit here in Cambridge, and her research is looking at how government makes obesity policy and what role scientific evidence plays and the particular influence of policy entrepreneurs. Hopefully you'll make clear, Dolly, what a policy entrepreneur is as you talk. Prior to her PhD, Dolly led the childhood obesity and grassroots sports research at the Centre for Social Justice, which is a think tank, and she was a parliamentary researcher in the House of Lords. She co-founded 50/50, Parliament's cross-party Ask Her to Stand campaign, which helps get more women selected and elected. And she's an ambassador of military veterans charity Forward Assist and ex-offenders employment charity Tempus Novo. Dolly, over to you.
Thank you so much, Teresa, for that very kind introduction. It really is an enormous pleasure and honour to be speaking, especially alongside such esteemed speakers at this event. And thank you to the brilliant organisers as well. So following Giles, I'm going to be taking you from genetics to Westminster. And I wanted to kick off with two questions for you all watching, and perhaps, I don't know whether the chat function is available to use, but to explore these as we go. So my first question is, what do you think the purpose of government policy is? Is it to solve problems like making it less hard for people to enjoy a healthy diet? Or is it to signal things like the government's direction of travel, their issue focus, perhaps their ideology? Or is it a combination of many things? So question one is, what do you think the purpose of government policy is? And my second one is, when government does publish a policy, what do you expect to happen next? For example, do you expect the policy to actually be implemented? And once implemented, do you expect it to be monitored and evaluated for how and whether it actually works in practice? And what happens if the government changes? Do you think that the new government should learn from the mistakes and successes of the previous government and ensure that they learn from the past? So why am I asking you these questions? Well, this year, 2021, marks 30 years of government obesity policy in England, and yet as the entire event that we're focused on today, it hasn't actually become easier to live a healthy life and eat well in that time. And also within that time, the government, as Teresa has set out, has not successfully reduced the prevalence of obesity or the related inequalities, which I understand Corinna will be talking about later. So the questions I pose to you about what the purpose of government policy is and what you expect to happen next really came from the analysis of all government obesity policies that I conducted with my brilliant supervisor, Professor Martin White. And knowing that there had been 30 years of government obesity policy, but not really much to show for it, raised these questions for me about what we expect and what we should expect from government policy related to this issue. And we can discuss more about this in the Q&A, any particular aspects, but I thought I would just briefly share the overview of the findings, and I will show you an image that hopefully shows just how many strategies that we've had in those 30 years. So as you can see, it was in 1991 that the UK government first formally recognised its role in tackling obesity and set the first obesity reduction targets. And since then, we have had 14 government obesity strategies containing almost 700 policies. And yet these have largely been unfit for purpose, which based on the prevalence speaks for itself. Despite there being a very wide range of policy types proposed, from information campaigns and school policies to stronger levers such as the soft drinks industry levy and more recent policies on unhealthy advertising and promotions, the government policies have largely been proposed in a way that means they're unlikely to actually be implemented. And what's more is the leading focus of government over the last 3 decades has been on trying to get people to change their own behaviour without making that easier by shaping the environment, socioeconomic and other such important influences. And there also appears to have been very little to almost no policy learning from previous successes and failures, which may explain why we tended to see recycled policy ideas proposed again and again, year after year, and in some cases, literally the next year. So, but on a positive note, because we don't want to end on anything otherwise, things do seem to be improving. So more policies in recent strategies, such as the one published last year, the Tackling Obesity Strategy, have focused on shaping the wider environmental determinants, such as advertising and promotions, as well as investing in weight management services. So which really these outcomes should rebalance things so that healthy food is in the spotlight and ensure it's easier for us all to live a healthy life regardless of our background. And more of the policies more recently have been proposed in a way that's likely to lead to implementation, which we are actually seeing. Hopefully it goes through, but with government recently confirming the implementation of their major policies from last year's strategy, which is set to be implemented or come into action in 2022. But really what our analysis shows is perhaps one of the reasons it's still so hard to eat healthily today is because of these long-standing problems related to government policy. And perhaps if we could help clarify what we expect and what we should expect from government policy, we can move towards a situation where the main purpose and outcome of government policy is to meaningfully solve problems. And coming back to your point, Teresa, about policy entrepreneurs, these really are people, exceptional people in the policy making process who can influence policy change very effectively. Perhaps a takeaway from this is if we could all become a little bit more policy entrepreneurial and help influence the policy process more effectively, then we can really see that actually happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dolly. You've raised a lot of really, well, two overarching questions and other questions. So I'll resist the temptation of coming back on those and ask Corinna to make some introductory comments. So Corinna Hawkes, as I mentioned earlier, is a professor at City, University of London, where she's a director of the Centre for Food Policy. She teaches on the MSc in food policy and leads programs generating evidence from people's lived experience to inform more equitable policy to address obesity and all forms of malnutrition globally, of which obesity is just one. She's a co-investigator of the UK's Obesity Policy Research Unit and vice chair of London's Child Obesity Task Force. And she's also a distinguished fellow at the George Institute for Global Health. So Corinna, looking forward to your comments.
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk at this event today, and good to be here with such fantastic ideas from my fellow panelists. So thanks very much for this invitation. So what I'm going to say has been, I think it's about two things. There's why is it so hard to be healthy, and there's why is it just so hard to change it? Why is it so hard that those government policies, despite all of this 20 years of effort, haven't made that difference? And I think one of the reasons is because people aren't trying to understand what the problem is from the perspective of the people who experience it. And that's the work that we're trying to do. And I really want to flag my colleagues Anna Isaacs, Kimberly Leave and Charlotte Gallagher-Squires, who I work with at the Centre for Food Policy, who've taught me so much through the research that they're doing in our team at the Centre for Food Policy. And what I've learned from trying to understand the problem from the people who experiences it, which I don't think the politicians have really do, which I think leads to some of the policy implementation problems, is the reason it's so hard to be healthy is because life is pretty hard. It's pretty hard for privileged people such as myself. We all face challenges in our lives, and in a whole host of different ways. And eating unhealthily is a simple and easy way to cope with it. And it's simple and easy because the food environment makes eating unhealthily, as Giles has already pointed out, and Dolly, so accessible, affordable, and appealing. So just imagine if you're a young couple working really long hours with a tiny baby, living in a tiny space with a tiny kitchen. Eating from a cheap local takeaway makes sense most nights. It just so happens that the high fat and salt content is going to increase their weight and blood pressure. As an adult, if we've had a super stressful and exhausting day and feel emotionally drained, picking up a pack of biscuits at the supermarket is made so tempting because it's half price right by the front door. And then we eat the lot, even though we tell ourselves that we shouldn't. if our kids are pestering us in that supermarket for the unhealthy foods with Peppa Pig on the front, and we've got little resources to do anything else interesting with them that day, buying that product, even though it's a bit more expensive than we wanted, is a way of showing love to our kids. Or if our kids refuse to eat the foods that we want to put on the table because they're healthy, and we have to think about our budget, it's going to go to waste, and that means wasted money. So let's roll out the freezer foods that aren't so high in nutritional value. It actually makes sense to do so. Or for young people coping with the stress of schoolwork or exams, who want to relax a bit by hanging out with their friends, and the places to go are just selling unhealthy food. So in other words, our food environment is ironically, in one sense, serving up what we want. It's serving up, as Giles said, those hyper palatable food that brings us pleasure, that can help us get through our day. But if you look at it another way, the food environment is actually ruthlessly, cynically exploiting us when we're down. It's saying, you've had a tough day, give in. This is going to make you feel better. But over the long term, of course, it won't. It'll make you sicker. So it's asking us to make that choice, and Giles referred to this, between the short-term gain of building our well-being through eating this food and the long-term loss of our health. So rather than saying, we recognize how life tough is, and we're going to help you be healthier, it's saying, we know how tough life is, and we're going to kick you a bit when you're down, but because we're going to feed you with what feels right in the short term, it's what's going to make you sicker in the long term. And of course, all of these problems are much harder for people who are experiencing inequalities, because as Giles said, they can't throw money at it. They have less coping mechanism, unlike people who are in a more privileged situation. So it's hard to be healthy, both because the vast majority of people face some kind of struggle or challenge in their lives that making eating healthily appealing, and because the food environment out there is exploiting our human vulnerability.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We've got quite a lot of questions, which is great to see. I'm going to kick off, and some of these questions that I had are echoed in some of the questions that are coming up. So don't feel that you need to spend too long on this. But I think all three of you, for me, raised the question about the importance. Corinna, you mentioned inequalities, but I think we're talking about poverty. So we've got food insecurity, latest figures, 43% of families on universal credit, 10% of the whole population. So food insecurity measured by, on a scale ranging from worrying about running out of money to buy food, all the way to spending more than 24 hours without eating anything. So we've got, you know, food insecurity. You've talked, Corinna, about people's, these are my words, people's cognitive capacity burdened by trying to make ends meet, working in jobs where there isn't security. So two questions. One is, to what extent is tackling poverty going to be an important component of any policy for tackling obesity, including childhood obesity? And secondly, Dolly, thank you for explaining about the policy entrepreneurs. The other group that possibly have more influence are the commercial sector with their powerful interests who are working in the other direction. So to what extent do each of you feel we should be tackling the commercial determinants? Snickers, they're funding grassroots football clubs for kids. I think they are sponsoring England and Scotland football teams. Coca-Cola sponsoring UEFA, a long-term sponsor, the longest lasting sponsor of the Olympics. So some quick comments from each of you on poverty and commercial determinants. Giles, I'll turn to you first because you spoke first. If you want to comment on either of those.
Yeah, I'll go with the poverty. The commercial determinants are less in my realm of expertise. I think we do have to tackle poverty, if only because that is the one lever that we actually have control over. Poverty is I just want to say this, poverty is a choice. We're the sixth richest country in the world. It is a choice. It's a political choice. Okay, and so I think it's something we can actually sort, because the other half of the story is biology. And there's two options of doing biology, I guess. The first is therapeutics of any number, and they are going to be available, and we can use those. And the second is changing our genes. Look, whether or not we want to do it, we can do it, we should do it. It's not exactly something that's in the realm of reality. So I think in terms of the short to medium term, my view is tackling the choice of poverty is a way to actually reduce this burden the quickest.
Thank you very much. I like that. Poverty is a choice, political choice. Dolly.
Yeah, I mean, related to, I'll quickly answer both. Related to the poverty question, I'd say what we found from the analysis is that the largest proportion of all policies were high agency, meaning that they demand people to use a lot of personal resource in order for them to work. And we know from some evidence that these are less likely to be effective and equitable. So the fact that the government has focused more on policies that are less likely to be equitable probably answers that question of the shift needing to move towards more population level measures that demand less from individual agency and just make it easier for people to live healthy lives without having to think too much about it, based on all the reasons that Corinna so brilliantly set out. And then in regards to the commercial determinants, there was a very, very strong theme that ran throughout the analysis, again, around sporting events and how much those relate to a higher saliency on the questions of sponsorship and food companies playing a role in the kind of health zone. And we're seeing that again. I see that someone has raised the Cristiano Ronaldo point in one of the questions, which we know was an incredibly powerful recent moment around that. And this happened again in 2012 with the Olympics. It's happened in relation to other sporting events. So maybe this is a good chance for a call to action that this is the time, mid-Euros, where I will not be the only one that's spotting how many food and drinks company adverts are happening every moment around the Euros, to raise these questions about policies in regards to commercial sponsorship, particularly around sporting events and anything health related in schools and that sort of side of things.
Thanks very much, Dolly. Corinna, do you want to come back on poverty?
Yeah, clearly from what I said, I definitely think it's a really important thing to tackle. It's not the only thing, I should add. It's not like this is just a problem of poverty and everything associated with it. But it is an incredibly important aspect of it. But it's not something that Department of Health and Social Care can really address. So we have this problem that unless you have a whole of government approach taken to this, it won't get fixed. The Department of Health is trying to do the things within its mandate and trying to work with others to do that. But it's a problem that has to be tackled by other parts of government, so it makes it more difficult. But I'd like to just add a point to this about the irony of this situation, and to point out that, again, one of the reasons it's so hard is because of the macroeconomic situation that kind of governs our world. Is that one of the reasons that people are deprived in terms of income, assets, material goods, and so on, is because they're in underpaid jobs with very difficult working conditions, which result from inequalities in labour markets brought about by a macroeconomic system. The same system that has as its economic model consumerism, consumer choice, and cheap goods for consumers. So what this macroeconomic system does, it makes some people poor and then says the driver of the system is to buy lots of cheap goods, including food. So it's getting at people from both ends. And of course, one of the large components of this macroeconomic system are food companies, which is an incredibly important part of our global economic activity. So it's all enmeshed in this really big systems context. And I'm reluctant to say that because it all seems to get too big, complicated and complex. But I'm saying that just because we've got to actually just admit it's a tough nut to crack. It is hard to change for individuals, and it's hard for change for governments, and it's hard to change across the world because of these really big macroeconomic issues.
Thanks very much to all three of you. I'm now going to turn to some of the questions in the box, and some of them have been removed because you've all dealt with them in that last round. So at the top, we have at the moment, Rob asks, in his book, Giles suggests we can improve people's health by subsidizing healthier foods. And this is a question to all of you. Are there examples of communities or countries where this has been done, and how successful has it been? So this is subsidizing healthier foods. Giles, it was asked of you, but I'm going to ask all of you to come in on that.
To be fair, I think it should be done. I don't know, me personally, because it's not what I study, of the evidence of who has done it and whether or not it has worked. But I do believe, it's a terrible thing to say because I have no evidence for it, but just my view is that if we improve the incentive structure, knowing how our poor little human brains work, of actually making, if you make the easier choice the healthier choice, then I think that is just the lowest, kinetic energy route that we will take in order to do it. But no, I don't know off the top of my head who has done it, and so whether or not there's any, I guess.
So I think one of the questions would be subsidizing healthier food. One might need to have the full economic cost on the less healthy food by removing subsidies on those. Dolly or Corinna, do you want to come in on that?
I can give an example, but Dolly, perhaps you want to go first.
No, you go for. I was going to suggest Amsterdam, seeing as that's something that we both looked at, and Corinna, you were there first, so you should absolutely go for it.
I mean, I think that we're not on strong ground here for this being a dominant policy, but it's yeah, go on.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's the Americans who've tried this most, and I don't think it's a good idea to say let's import things from America given their obesity rates, but because of cultural issues around perspectives on welfare in the United States has led, rightly or wrongly, to more of a focus of direct food provision as opposed to just using money as welfare and social support for low-income families. And one of those is called the Women and Infants Children's Program, and it gives low-income women and pregnant women money in order to spend on food for their children. There's a package in this food, and they changed the package of food from a less healthy package, which it was originally because they weren't thinking about nutrition, to a healthier package. And when the package of food became healthier, obesity rates did drop among the recipients of that food. And that's often cited as the strongest example about how if you actually subsidize healthier foods and people have those healthier foods, that because it represented a change from less healthy to healthier, it did actually lead to a decline, or is associated, I should say, with a decline of obesity rates. And there's some other examples that shows that when you subsidize unhealthy foods, the opposite will happen.
Dolly, unless you want to come back in, shall we move on? I'm going to pick a question from your brilliant supervisor, Dolly. You already gave him a puff earlier. So this is a question from Martin White. Giles made a case that socioeconomic differences in diet are due to differences in time and money available. So that's sort of the resources that the individuals and the families have. But how important do you think differences in the physical and digital spaces where people spend time are? So geographical differences in exposure to hot food takeaways, differences in exposure to food marketing in our neighborhoods and online.
I mean, I think that's gonna definitely have a role to play. I mean, in very many ways, I guess the online, I don't know what the socioeconomic divide is of online, but clearly, you know, if you are struggling to get food, the likelihood of you being able to get online is going to be lower. So I think the online marketing is targeting in very many ways a different market, but the availability in terms of the geographical locales of fast food, ultra processed food availability. And I'm telling Martin, I'm teaching a grandma how to suck eggs here. I mean, it's your findings, to show that there's actually increased density of such food outlets in areas of lower social, in the more urban areas and areas of more socioeconomic class. So I think it all has a role to play, except for I think the online advertising is targeting, broadly speaking, a different market.
But I think also just picking up on Martin and Tom Burgoyne's research, documenting the difference in availability of these fast food outlets by deprivation. As I recall, there's also an interaction with the individuals. So those who have higher levels of education, I think it is, so which would be more cognitive and social and time resources, of which all of you have spoken, were less likely to be using those takeaway places. So I think about it as really a double whammy, that if you're living in poverty, you've got more of these outlets around, and we know that poverty depletes your resource to resist them. So thanks for asking that question, Martin. Dolly or Corinna, do you want to come in on that? So the next question from Adriana, the top one now, I think we possibly covered it, but anyway, Rian, how can we expect healthier food access when big food is such a strong lobby here, in addition to big sugar too? Corinna, do you want to talk about junk food or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is such a major issue because so many people who work in large food companies will say, well, we want to sell healthier food, but people just won't buy it. And so they will blame the consumer. But the reason that citizens are buying this food are the reasons that I set out earlier. But it kind of gets this caught up in this vicious cycle of supply and demand, where companies will just say they're just supplying what people want, which, as I said, in a way they are. But actually, I think what people want is to have their needs served, but in a healthy way. And that's more expensive and more complicated and requires more than a simple market mechanism. So to a certain extent, you've kind of got to feel sorry for big food because they think they're just doing their job. And they think they're just delivering what they should for what people want. And I think the issue is there's a mindset there that says, well, we would if we could, and it's not really our fault. So you end up with a situation where big food companies aren't really willing to take responsibility. And then they say, well, government should do that. And then governments say, well, we get lobbied by big food not to do this. So you get a situation where everyone is blaming everybody else for not doing enough, when in reality, everybody needs to do something. And I think the main issue for big food for me is that the brutality to which civil servants and others are subjected to in their lobbying is not pleasant. It really is not pleasant. And I see this all over the world, the same arguments being used, whether it's South Africa, Thailand, or the UK, wherever it is, the same arguments will be used about why government should not put strong policies into place, time and time again. And I know that companies have the right to defend their interests, but it really doesn't seem to be about supporting health. It seems to be more about supporting their ability to compete with other companies, which is part of the engine of economic development, of course. So it's a very tricky one and a major international discussion, and a major reason why we haven't seen more progress.
Thank you. It is a complex dance. I want to come on to a question from someone called Sustain V2, and this is about trade policy. So the question is, we just saw the UK and Australia celebrate their trade deal with baskets of Tim Tams, Penguins, Vegemite and Marmite. And And I want to introduce a sustainability question here because it also focused on beef and lamb, all tariff-free to make them cheaper for us, all at the same time that the government is restricting marketing on foods that are high in fat, sugar and salt. How do we achieve better policy coherence across government? So we've got a commitment. I think we were the first government to have a commitment to net zero 2050. So Dolly, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I have to give a shout out to Dr. Kelly Parsons, who has produced an amazing report on food policy connectedness, although I think it should be called food policy disconnectedness because of just how disconnected it is. And what I would say is that it's sort of too early to share details of the findings through the case study that I'm exploring at the moment, but I hope that a lot of these explanations will be found in this. But the next phase of my research is an in-depth case study of one government strategy, one of the most recent ones that was published in 2016, which is known as the Childhood Obesity Plan, and understanding why it is that such policy disconnectedness can happen, and why you have a government that has produced a strategy tackling all of these sort of commercial determinants at the same time as celebrating a trade policy with photos of holding up sugary goods as the symbol of that success, is because of the siloed departmental nature of government policy making. And it's important to understand how it works in practice and what is possible in terms of creating health as an aspiration and outcome of all policy. And it's the same thing as we're just talking about with the commercial organizations. How do you make health or create a world in which health is a priority for organizations where their main priority is not that and might actually be at odds with it, and understanding how it works and when it does work. And I know that that links to another question about someone asking of a good example of where policy has been developed with policy entrepreneurs based on evidence. And I would say the soft drinks industry levy is a superb example. And again, that's something that I'm exploring, how that came about and why it was so successful, and how the people that came to be very, very influential got to be in those positions. And how it managed to be a priority for departments that have, again, sometimes conflicting priority. And that goes with the advertising policies more recently. That might be the only way that is, you know, revenue generating or seen as revenue generating for a department that's focused solely on that. And this might be at odds with it. So understanding the policy disconnectedness and where the opportunities are for that crossover, I think is absolutely critical. And I hope the kind of next phase of my research will be able to provide a little bit more of an explanation about how that comes about.
Corinna or Giles, do you want to comment on either giving some examples where you can see policy connectedness, because I think we can see policy disconnectedness everywhere, or just examples of where you think what you've talked about are being implemented?
I mean, I can't comment too much about. I know it's disconnected. I can't think of a single policy that has been connected between the departments. And I think one of the underlying problems is going back to this initial thing that people think that healthy eating is a choice. So in other words, we should be able to just make it. So therefore so the focus is on the wrong element. Whereas if I think we can get the policymakers to understand why it's not a choice, why, you know, we have to improve the environment in order to get our choices right, I think we will continue having this disconnect, because then there'll always be this I guess there'll always be this tension between economics and health, but the longer we live, the longer we pay taxes, surely.
But they're not stupid people, the policymakers. So I'm keen to think about why it is. Many of them will be attending webinars like this, so they'll have heard the evidence. So trying to think about it from a systems perspective. So Dolly is analysing this, which is great. Corinna, what's your sense? Well, first of all, can you give us some example of where there has been policy connectedness?
I think that there are engagement between Department of Health and Department of Education in terms of acting in schools, and I think that is important to point out. And I'm not saying that always works perfectly, but that certainly happens. And if you look at the soft drinks industry levy, that does involve the Treasury, and there are other examples of cross-government working in certain respects. But it's at the bigger level that it doesn't happen, which is the economic piece. I think when you look at the Tim Tams, the Australian biscuit, and the Penguin, the British biscuit being held up, it is just a bad message. But when you look at the economics of it, what they would argue is that, well, Tim Tams is just competing with penguins. So by importing Tim Tams, people will just eat Tim Tams rather than penguins, and Australians will eat penguins rather than Tim Tams. And so it's just seen as a competition, fair competition, not that people will eat more, they'll just eat different biscuits. So it's seen as just free trade is seen as the way is promoting fair competition to enable consumers to compete at lower prices, and then there'll be put downward pressure on prices. So, hey, people can have can spend less money on cookies, and therefore they have more money to spend on other things that they need, like rent or whatever it is. So at the core of the economic system is competition between companies to deliver to the consumers. And the lowest cost is seen as a sign of effective competition. And I think that is something which one part of government, the economic drivers of government, see as absolutely critical for economic growth. And it's completely counter to health because it encourages people to eat too much. In the name of the consumer is king and we need to have fair competition. That is a fundamental disconnect in the way our economy is run by part of government and the way that our health policy is delivered. And that disconnect, I haven't seen connected anywhere.
Okay, a way to go. I think we're coming now towards the end, regrettably. Actually, let's go for one more question. So this is from Adriana Manova. To what extent do you think in the UK childminders have the correct nutritional training to provide nutritious food? We know many parents rely on them for childcare, and we know how important this age is for the development of food preferences. Any comments on that? Giles, do you want to think about that in terms of early years development of food preferences?
I think from a development of food preferences, it is absolutely crucial. I mean, we know what culture, what our brought up culture has, and the differences in the types of food we like. Okay, and so independent of any biology, that's going to be important to and hit them young, metaphorically. So I can't imagine childminders have a unit on nutrition, given that I teach preclinical medicine, given that the medics have barely any nutritional training in it. Now, I don't know. I'm not familiar with the curriculum of childminders, but I just cannot imagine that there is a nutritional impact there. And I think there needs to be more broader education, I do think, on nutrition, so that we can get younger children learning these healthy choices early in life.
Well, certainly the behavioural science evidence would support you, Giles, thinking about the Food Dudes program, which sounds very dated in concept now, but it was it's a wonderful program that was first investigated by researchers at Bangor, whereby exposing children to small amounts of fruit and vegetables at an early age, in the context of them being reinforced by teachers, and families were involved as well, you can increase the amount of fruit and vegetables, and it's sustained over a period of time, because those preferences are importantly formed at an early age. Corinna or Dolly, do you want to come in on training of childminders?
Dolly, go ahead.
I was just going to say a quick point in relation to the policies on this. That again, government policies have been very dominated by professional development policies, as we coded them by. But things like better training for health professionals, childcare, that sort of thing, teachers, you name it, And I would be probably more interested in your answer, Teresa, in relation to the behavioural science of this. Is the assumption around training is that you train a professional to understand more about nutrition, and then they put it into practice, and lo and behold, the problem solved and everyone's healthier. And we know, again, from everything that's been set out in this event, that it's not that simple. There are so many factors. Even if someone is nutritionally educated and knows what is, you know, good for them, bad for them, whatever, that's the assumption that they're going to put it into practice. We know that that doesn't necessarily work in reality. So I would challenge again that even around the professional development policies, unless they come, not only are they less likely to be implemented because of the way that they're often proposed, but also they're based on the assumption of that very rational, linear concept of behavioural.
It should be, yeah, evidence-based. So I'm now being a poor chair because we're running out of time. So I'm going to cut off Corinna and do one round of each of you. And building on what Dolly said about wanting everybody to go away with something positive, you've got 30 seconds each to say something that you would like people to go away with. So Corinna, can I start with you?
Yeah, I'm going to be shamelessly and say, if you want something to go away with, look up Bite Back 2030. I'm chair of the board, so I'm biased. Bite Back 2030 is a youth movement designed to for young people, to engage young people in fighting for a healthier food environment for themselves. And I think getting young people engaged and active in calling for change, it's their generation which is going to suffer next. Let's get the young people speaking. Let's get them speaking out. Let's get them to bring the attention to the problem to the politicians. Check out Bite Back 2030, which is trying to do
fantastic. We've been talking about the policymakers, but actually it's bottom up. And that will get the policymakers engaged. Thanks very much for that. Dolly.
I'm going to go back to the policymakers and say implement, monitor and evaluate your policies, because we can only learn by doing. And let's start with the most recent government strategy and implement all the policies in there.
Implement, monitor and evaluate. Thanks very much. Giles.
Well, okay, I'm going back to basics as well from where I come from. And I think we need to all understand that healthy eating, body weight is not a choice. And once we understand that, we can begin to think differently about the solutions that need to be there, all the way from the ground up to the people who make these decisions.
Thank you so much. But what we have learned this evening is that there are some choices in the hands of policymakers and also communities. So I'm just going to thank the panel on behalf of everybody who's been attending this seminar. And as part of the pandemic, we lose that deafening applause that the three of you would have had for what has been a fantastic discussion. And thank you to those who've joined the webinar. It's just been great to have your questions too. So many thanks to everybody. And there's a final slide that somebody is going to show just to remind you of the event you've been to, and that there will be a follow-up email inviting you for your feedback. So once again, many thanks to the panelists for joining me this evening, and thanks to everybody else who has joined this webinar. Farewell, and let us go forward, encouraging everybody to think about connectedness and policy connectedness. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.